Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Rukmini Banerjee, and I'm one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows for the year. The U.S. prison population has increased 500% in the past 40 years. However, crime rates have not increased proportionally in that same time. Instead, the dramatic increase in prison population can be attributed to law and policy changes that are aimed at funneling even innocent people into the carceral system. To outline some of these policy changes and the way in which the prison system has been designed to trap the most vulnerable in society, we have with us today Professor Justin P. Brooks. Professor Brooks is the director and co-founder of the California Innocence Project. He founded the Innocence Project when he moved to California in 1999 to work at California Western School of Law. Under his direction, the project has exonerated dozens of innocent people, trained hundreds of law students, and changed multiple laws in California related to wrongful convictions. Professor Brooks is also the founder and director of California Western's Latin American Institute for Law and Justice, an organization dedicated to training law students and lawyers in Latin America in improving justice systems. He is also the founder and director of Red Innocente, an organization devoted to starting and supporting innocence organizations throughout Latin America. Professor Brooks has been recognized several times by the Los Angeles Daily Journal as one of the top 100 lawyers in California, and in 2010 and 2012, California Lawyer Magazine honored him with the Lawyer of the Year award. Professor Brooks has served as counsel on many high-profile criminal cases and exonerated over 35 innocent people, including former NFL player Brian Banks. Professor Brooks is also the author of the only legal casebook devoted to the topic of wrongful convictions. Today, Professor Brooks will speak about how almost anyone can be swept into the carceral system, regardless of whether they committed a crime or not. Instead, one may go to prison because they hired a bad lawyer, bear a slight resemblance to a case suspect, or simply appear to be guilty because of how they handle an awkward silence. During his talk, Professor Brooks will reference his new book, You Might Go to Prison Even Though You're Innocent. In the book, Professor Brooks offers an up-close account of wrongful convictions and innocence claims that he has fought. Today, he will weave this story into the larger landscape of the American justice system. Before we get started, a few quick reminders. Please take this time to silence and put away your cell phones. Be present and get ready to engage in dialogue and ask thoughtful questions. We have an amazing program here for you today. As usual, video and audio recording by the audience is strictly prohibited. Welcome to the Athenaeum.
Wow, I could listen to her talk about me all night. That was... Thank you so much. It's a tremendous honor for me. I'm so happy to be here. And if this group of students at this table is a reflection of what you guys are doing here at this school, it's very, very impressive. So thank you so much for this welcome. I'm very happy here to talk about this topic of wrongful convictions. So the book that you see, the very bold cover in front of you, was something I was asked to do about 3 years ago. A publisher asked me to reflect on my work of the last 32 years in the criminal justice system and the past decades working with innocent people in innocence cases, and kind of talk about why. You know, when a plane crashes, we want to know why the plane crashed. You want to study the plane crash to then stop other planes from crashing. And that was really what this book is all about. It was looking at the causes of wrongful conviction with the theme of this can happen to anybody, which is something I think people don't fully embrace. You know, the battle 30 years ago was to convince people that there were innocent people in prison. And that battle is over because we've now documented more than 3,000 cases of wrongful conviction in the United States alone. But now the battle is more the idea of who's been wrongfully convicted and what types of cases, and certain cases that people have a dose of cynicism about. And I think it's human nature, by the way, to not believe in wrongful convictions, because then you have to believe that one day you might be wrongfully convicted. So, and I've been doing this work for so long and so firmly believe, by the way, that anyone could be wrongfully convicted, that I literally have a plan for my first day in prison. And it goes something like this. I get in there, I go out on the yard, I pick out all the shot callers, and I've spent enough time in California prisons that I know how to do that and who they are. And I'll be like, you guys get over here, the Crips and the Bloods and everybody. Look, Get the 5 of them together. I'm going to be your lawyer, your lawyer, your lawyer, and your lawyer. I'm going to be working in the law library every day on behalf of you guys. Keep everybody else here away from me. That's the deal. So, it's real. So this journey into innocence work began for me 27 years ago. Before that, I was a traditional criminal defense attorney. A lot of people would say that I worked for the Guilty Project before I worked for the Innocence Project, because most of my clients were in fact guilty. But I read in the newspaper 27 years ago about this young woman, Marilyn Malero, and she was sitting on death row in Illinois. And the article said that she was sentenced to death on a plea bargain. So let me have a sip of water while you let that soak in for a second. In fact, what's wrong with that sentence? What's wrong with that sentence over here at this table? I'll give you a glow-in-the-dark California Innocence Project bracelet. Sentenced to death on a plea bargain. Yes! You're supposed to reduce your sentence. How could you possibly be sentenced to death on a plea bargain? It's a plea. It's not a bargain by any circumstances. You haven't bargained anything. Like, what, waive torture? There's nothing on the table. So it made no sense to me. So I went out and met with her on death row. She was scheduled to be executed. And I said, how did you end up here? And she said, my lawyer said the best thing to do was to plead out. And I said, and he plead out and he got the death penalty? Yeah. Okay. And then she says, and I'm innocent. I said, you're innocent and you're sentenced to death and you pled? Yeah. So I went back. I was teaching first-year criminal law students at a law school in Michigan. I told them exactly what I just told you. I said, who wants to help me out? And 4 brave souls raised their hands. And that night they came over to my house and we sat around the kitchen table and started going through the police reports and started putting the case together. And that night, for me, the Innocence Project was born. My students, we then, that weekend, drove to Chicago, went to Humboldt Park where the shooting happened. We stood where the one eyewitness said she saw this one girl hand a gun to my client and shoot this guy. And from where we were standing, we couldn't even see the bathroom. We couldn't see the building where they were standing in front of. And the claim was that in front of that building at midnight with no lighting, that this witness saw one person hand another person a gun. And that is the equivalent, by the way, when I measured it off, it was 400 feet. That's the equivalent of sitting in a football stadium behind one end zone in the dark and saying, I saw someone hand someone a hot dog behind the opposite end zone. It's exactly that. I finally track her down, and then I find out, oh, surprise, surprise, the one person in the city of Chicago who saw this shooting is a girlfriend of the victim. And that wasn't in any police reports. It was just shocking to me, even as a criminal defense attorney, that this could happen, that no investigation would happen, that an innocent 21-year-old woman gets sentenced to death without a trial. She unfortunately did this path of firing her public defender because her friends told her she wanted a real lawyer, and then fires a woman at the public defender's office there who'd done hundreds of homicide cases and hires someone for $10,000 in the neighborhood who never handled anything remotely like this. And for the $10,000, he went into court and entered a plea without even talking to the district attorney about a deal. And that case just blew my mind so much that after I got her death sentence reversed, which was a big task, I went home to my wife and gave her the bad news, which was I was quitting my tenured faculty position and I was starting the Innocence Project. And we were moving to the belly of the beast, California, the largest prison system in the world. 3 strikes, mandatory minimums, the death penalty. This was the place to come and do this. A couple of years before, Barry Scheck, a lawyer who was one of O.J. Simpson's lawyers, he started the project in New York. A couple of others cropped up, and I started the one here in California. And since then, that's what we've been doing. And as I said, why do we need these projects? We now have, after decades of doing this work, more than 3,000 documented cases from all the projects and all the defense attorneys doing this work around the country. And the most common question I'm asked is, well, how many innocent people are in prison? And that is unanswerable. But here's a statistic that gives you an idea of how large that number may be. We have walked 4% of the people on death row off death row after finding they're innocent. Now, if you think about death penalty cases, they are the most scrutinized, they get the most media attention, they get the most lawyers assigned to them, they have the most focus. And if we're making mistakes at a 4% level, and by the way, those are the lucky ones where we proved they were innocent, right? That means there's more people where it was unprovable, didn't have the evidence. Then what's the number in simple drug possession cases? What's the number in simple assault cases? We don't know, but it's certainly higher than 4%. And when you look at our system, when we're talking about millions of people who are incarcerated in the United States, which has the largest prison system in the world, and to put that in context, we incarcerate more people than China. China has 1 billion more people, but we incarcerate more people than China. And we have a higher incarceration rate than any other country in the world. That number is very high. So the question is why? Why are innocent people going to prison? Well, in Marilyn's case, it was clearly chapter 1 of my book, You Hired the Wrong Lawyer. And the whole history of lawyers in America and defense attorneys is a fascinating one. Los Angeles has the oldest and largest public defender office in the nation, okay? Los Angeles had a public defender's office for 50 years before there was even created a right to counsel in the United States. So the rest of the country, people weren't getting lawyers at all, and yet here that was happening. And it wasn't until 1932 that the Supreme Court even started talking about rights to lawyers, and that was in a case where these young black men were falsely accused of raping these white women on a train, and 5 of their trials occurred in the course of 1 day, and all 5 were found guilty and sentenced to death within the course of a day without having counsel and all being illiterate. And the Supreme Court came in and said, you know what, we don't like telling states what to do with their criminal justice system, but this is a little too much. You guys got to do better than that. It then took them 30 more years to come back in and go, actually, what you got to do is give them a lawyer. That's, it wasn't until 1963 in Gideon versus Wainwright that there was any real right to counsel in the United States. And it wasn't until 1984 that we even started putting teeth on to say lawyers have to meet a certain quality test. And let me guarantee you that we're still not there in terms of quality test, in terms of how we evaluate lawyers and how they do their jobs. I'm a big fan of public defenders' offices. My son is San Diego's newest public defender as of a couple of weeks ago. I'm very proud of him. Because public defenders have supervisors, training, experience, and investigators. Of the 38 innocent people I've personally walked out of prison, 35 were represented by private lawyers at trial. And that's the thing that most people don't know, is that actually the mistakes are happening more often with lawyers in private practice that are more likely to cut corners because they're running a business than in public defenders' offices where they may be overworked, but there's at least somebody looking over their shoulders. Now, that case that I started in Chicago, I got her off death row 25 years ago, but I couldn't get the guilty plea withdrawn. The court allowed me to go back to a new jury and argue for life over death, but they wouldn't allow me to withdraw the guilty plea. I took it up through all the state processes. I took it through the federal processes. I petitioned the United States Supreme Court. I went to the United Nations and asked for a declaration that Illinois' criminal justice system was in violation of international human rights. They still haven't ruled on that. I spent the next 25 years litigating that case. I finally got that case, her fully released, fully exonerated, and charges dismissed against her in October. In October. I worked on that case for 27 years. I started that case when I was 29 years old. I finished that case when I was 57. If that gives you any indication about how hard this work is and how difficult it is to unring the bell of a wrongful conviction. And the only reason I finally got the district attorney to dismiss the charges against her is when the detective who set her up, who's now been linked to more than 30 wrongful convictions and has had has been fired, and there's been about $100 million in lawsuits against him. And you can look him up, Detective Guevara. in Chicago. But this is me meeting with her in October for dinner in Chicago when I finally finish the case. In chapter 2, I get into the interesting topic from my work that I don't think anyone's really written about. I know no one's written about it because I did a lot of the research too on it outside my own casework. There's an interesting phenomenon that I see more wrongful convictions in rural areas and more wrongful convictions in urban areas. In other words, if you live in the suburbs, you're less likely to be wrongfully convicted. But rural areas, the phenomenon is they are so poorly equipped to process crime scenes that they make outrageous mistakes. They're just not used to having homicides. So like my client, Bill Richards, when he called the police and said, I came home, my wife's beaten to death, they went out and didn't process the crime scene until the next day and left her body outside where dogs actually started burying it because they didn't even secure dogs when the police were on the scene. And they didn't do any time. A death analysis, they just didn't know what they were doing. And I've seen that consistently in a lot of my casework. It took me a while, because I'm not from California when I came out here, to realize that it sometimes gets weirder the further from the water you get. I know that's a horrible generalization, but I grew up on the East Coast and in Puerto Rico, and I'd never been to a desert. But some of these little towns out in red California, I guess let's call it for short term, there's some pretty poor work being done. I always say most of my cases come from LA, but most of my good cases come from the desert. Those are the ones we look closely at. And then there's the opposite phenomenon of what's happening, and this is Bill, who took 20 years, took me 19 years of litigation to get him out after proving him innocent with DNA. And then there's the over-policing in the inner city that gets a lot more attention. There's a lot written about of statistically how more likely you are to be wrongfully convicted just based on you living in certain neighborhoods. I have clients that I've exonerated that were convicted based on bad identifications from photos taken of them when they were children living in certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles, because the police would come around and just take photos of kids, and then based on the neighborhood you live in and the color of the clothes you're wearing, you're going to end up in a gang book, and then someday someone might pick you from that gang book. And if you want to see an interesting thing, go on Google Gangs to take a look at the gang maps of LA that are utilized then to categorize people into those gang books. And so it is a lot easier to end up in that situation if you live in those neighborhoods. In chapter 3, I look at another interesting phenomenon in my cases, which is the person who's in a relationship with the person who's dead, particularly if they find them, is most likely to be the suspect in the case. So when you come home and find your deceased spouse, you are very likely to become a suspect if they don't find very quickly the person who did it. And I've had multiple cases of this. And there'll always be, by the way, that friend. Well, first of all, they'll be able to put you on the scene. Second of all, we do know statistically that most people who are murdered by their spouse. So it is a real phenomenon. But then there'll always be that friend who kind of wants to get in the drama that says, she told me they were having problems. And it's, any relationship that has any problems that anyone said to someone else, they're showing up in that trial. And you're getting convicted. This is Kim Long. She was an example of that. This is the moment of her exoneration. She came home, found her boyfriend beaten to death. She was a middle-class nurse living out in Ramona, and the police went after her when they couldn't close the case. And we ended up fully exonerating her and having all charges dismissed from her as well. In chapter 4, this topic close to, where's my expert right there? Our identification experts that you have here at your school. This is the #1 cause of wrongful conviction in a lot of studies. You look like somebody else in the world. This means, unfortunately, all of us could be wrongfully convicted based on that, because you probably look like somebody else in the world. And this is a very sophisticated issue of study that's worthy of PhDs and researchers like you have here doing this kind of research. But it's also very basic and simple in this sense. The weight that jurors give identifications is in no way connected to the quality of identifications. That's where it kind of starts. Jurors think it's good enough to convict somebody on, but we now know, based on the frailties of memory, the problems with identification procedures, many, many problems with this, that it's really not that great evidence a lot of the time, particularly when a victim doesn't know the suspect and it was a crime that just happened on a day at a certain time. And when you look at lineups, you also can see some basic reasons of the problems with identifications. And this is the lineup from my client Marilyn Malero's case. Now take a look at this lineup. I'm going to ask you this. Who do you think in this lineup is not concerned that they might be facing a double homicide charge and therefore is projecting that in the identification procedure? Who wouldn't you pick? Who wouldn't you pick? Yeah, why wouldn't you pick her? She's smiling. She's actually laughing. Why? Because they needed to do a lineup of Puerto Rican women. So they went around the police station and said, we need to get some young Puerto Rican women in here for a lineup. And went up to a secretary and said, could you stand in the lineup? And she said, oh, that sounds like fun. So she's in the lineup like, I'm in a lineup. I'm in a lineup. She's not getting picked. The person who's having a good time is not getting picked. The person who's relaxed, the person who's not concerned. And there's lots of reasons someone might be concerned that has nothing to do with them being guilty. Most of our communication is nonverbal. Most of it. And if you start paying attention in your life, you'll see that. Like, for instance, I could take a picture of this room right now and grade you 1 to 100 on how interested you are in what I'm saying. Right? And any one of my colleagues or professors here could do the same. After years and years of standing in front of a room, you know where the ones are, where the hundreds are, and where most of them are running around 50. It's all the nonverbal communication that's going on, and she's projecting something different. She's smiling too. Why? Because she's dropping off lunch with her sister in the probation department when they pulled her in. I don't know where they got Shorty from here, but she's having a good time too. Right? So, like, these three are enjoying the process. You know, it's not enjoying the process. My client with a 50-pound hands who looks like a first-year law student on call. She's scared to death. She just came out of a funeral for a friend of hers, and the police arrested her, interrogated her, and dragged her into this lineup. And this person, by the way, is the actual killer. Jackie Montanez. Who's doing Jackie Montanez? I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. 15 years old, 2 bullets, took out 2 guys, the back of the head. Everybody's projecting stuff. And there's lots of other problems. It's very complex, which I don't know if we have time to get into tonight, but I encourage you to sign up with your professors who teach this stuff, because it's fascinating how human memory works and how it doesn't work like a video camera, and how there's stages of memory from what's going on at the crime scene to the period of time where you're storing information to the process that the police use to extrapolate the information. And contamination can happen anywhere along this period of time. And your memories can change. In fact, if we're all honest right now, everyone in this room has changed one of your memories. Think back to a time where you told a story 3 or 4 times and you changed a fact in it. Maybe you, for some reason, you didn't want to be part of the story. Maybe you wanted to look cooler. I don't know. But you changed a fact. After 4 or 5 times telling that story, how many of you, let's be honest here, have then thought, did that really happen that way, or did I just make that up? There you go. And children, by the way, you can change their memories, and it's really fun. You got like a 4 or 5-year-old, they want to go to Disneyland. You just say, remember I took you to Disneyland last year. I bought you that red dress. And you bought a red dress, but it was somewhere else. When the child's like reeling from that, you say, and they're confused, you say, remember I bought you that cherry Coke at Disneyland? And you bought the cherry Coke at a movie theater. And you just keep combining real memories with false memories. Eventually that child's like, oh yeah, we went to Disneyland. Cheaper, no lines. My kids have no idea about their childhood. They grew up in the Matrix. Focus is the most important thing about memory. We only remember what we focus on, so weapons distort memory because that's the most important thing in a crime, not my face. So that can distort memory. Stress, students, distorts memory, no matter what anyone tells you. The student who's most relaxed on an exam scores higher. So anything you can do to get yourself to that state will assist you in your education. So don't pull all-nighters, don't fill yourself with caffeine, don't go on a diet of Doritos, be that person who's calm. And the more you stress about exams, the more it leads to failure. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Stress distorts memory and makes recall difficult. And cross-racial identification, I wish lawyers could talk more about this to juries. They're terrible at it. I read transcripts. I don't know why lawyers are so bad at it, because it's not about racism. It's about exposure. And it's about the idea that if you're not exposed to another race for a period of time, you're just not good at making those identifications. And particularly in the first 4 years of your life, when we develop our facial recognition software, and I've got a grandson right now, and I'm watching him do it, where he goes from he can only recognize his mother first because they're connected to the mother in such powerful ways, and then they recognize dad, and then eventually it's everybody else, or it's like eyes, nose, mouth, Papa, eyes, nose, mouth, Gigi, eyes, nose, mouth. If everybody's white around you, you're not going to be good at identifying non-white people, and that's just a fact. And people don't like talking about race, but that's really what it's all about. It's about exposure. Like what I've said to jurors is, I went to high school in Puerto Rico. I was the only gringo in my high school, right? I was surrounded by Puerto Rican kids every single day of high school. I don't think all Puerto Ricans look the same, because I had enough exposure to many, many Puerto Ricans, but I'm not as good as a Puerto Rican at identifying Puerto Ricans, because in my early childhood, I didn't have that constant exposure. We need to be comfortable with those topics. I've walked 6 people out of prison who were convicted based on cross-racial identifications. They're just bad most of the time. And as I said, without focus, there is no memory. Sin enfoque no hay memoria. Without focus, there is no memory. And so you gotta then look at the cases of where were the witnessed, where were they focused at the time of the crime? What information did they actually pull out? And then there's things like expectation that distorts memory, because we see what we expect to see. Okay, and it's a really deep thought. In fact, in Spanish you say, vemos lo que esperamos ver, which is like we see what we hope to see, even in Spanish. Esperar is to hope and to expect. And that influences what we see. You've all experienced this in different ways, and here's one way I think you've probably experienced it. You're listening, you hear a song, and that song is on a playlist that you've played many times. You start to hear the next song on your playlist play, and then you realize it's not your playlist. How many of you experienced that? You actually hear the first couple of notes in your head. That's expectation. That's created a trigger of something that's not there. And why is that important? Because often the police create expectations in witnesses' minds, like, we think we got the guy who did this, come on, take a look at this lineup. Well, now you know they're in there, and you're looking to say they're in there. That's not now an open scientific process. Your expectation is, it's one of these people, and that distorts the process. And expectation distorts how we see things. If I say this is an elderly woman, you're more likely to see an elderly woman than a young woman. This has been floating around since the 60s. If I say this is a Native American hedge, you're more likely to see that than the back of an Eskimo. If I say this is a musician, you're more likely to see that than a woman. Now, all of you repeat after me, Paris in the spring. Paris in the spring. Paris in the spring. All of you raise your hand, you see Paris in the spring. Paris in the spring, Paris in the spring, Paris in the spring, Paris in the spring. I notice the ID experts are not raising their hand. Good, because it's not Paris in the spring. It's Paris in the spring. That's how suggestivity works. That's how coding works. That's why here's another tip for your education. Don't edit your own work. Because you type it up, you're not expecting to see mistakes. You see it, oh, that's good, that's good, that's good too. You're not looking for mistakes, really. If you put it down for an hour, you'll be a better editor an hour later. If you put it down for a week, you'll be a way better editor. But you've coded it in your head and you don't see the inaccuracies because you're not expecting to see them. That's how it works. Your brain's easily confused. Like if you look at this for a minute, you start seeing black dots that don't exist. If you look at this for too long, it'll really freak you out. If you look at this, it starts to move even though it's not moving. If you look at this, it starts to move even though it's not moving. And here's my favorite one of these. Just take a look at the woman in the middle and the woman over there. Are they moving in the same direction? Yeah. Now just take a look at the woman in the middle and the other woman. Are they moving in the same direction? Now start moving your eyes back and forth between them and make the woman in the middle change direction with your brain. We don't see with our eyes, we see with our brains. And our brains are constantly trying to figure the world out. And here, this is contamination and suggestibility of what this is doing. And then this is suggestibility of what this is doing. And it's distorting what you see. And this is all leading up to the same point, that these processes are so important about how IDs are done, because our brains can get confused and we can get led down the wrong path, and there's lots of ways they go wrong. This is a classic. I went down a real rabbit hole with this one night. Has anyone else done that? You guys read the studies on this? There's a whole book written about this dress that was just taken in a shop, at a dress shop. How many people see what is obviously a black and blue dress? How many people see a white and yellow dress? How many people see a white and brown dress? There's usually a couple of percentage that see that. So why, because half of you are colorblind, and those of us who see black and blue, no. You got to go down the same rabbit hole I went down, but the bottom line is, my whole life experience of seeing shades of blue leads me to believe this is blue. My whole life experience of seeing black leads me to believe this is black. We have all had different experiences with colors our whole lives. And for some reason, the color tips over to another color for some of us than others. But there are many explanations about that, so I'm not throwing that out as gospel, because there's a lot of theories about it. But the bottom line is, we don't all see the same things all the time. That we know to be true. And then there's the relative opinion process, which is why some of us have fought so hard to get rid of six-pack photo arrays in California, around the country, and around the world, even though this is the standard practice, or was, for identifications forever. The problem is that when people are doing a relative opinion, it leads them down the wrong path. And in this study that was done, they had 100 witnesses witness a crime, and they said to all of them, the criminal may not appear in the lineup. 21% don't pick anyone. 3% go for number 1, 3% number 2, 54% number 3, 13% number 4, 3% number 5, 3% number 6. Then they tell the group, it's not number 3. Pick again. So you'd think all that pick number 3 would then drop to no choice because it's not the guy they picked. And that is not what happened. Most of them switched to number 4. Now, why is that problematic? Because if number 3 committed a crime, but they're not in the lineup, number 4 is going to prison for a crime they didn't commit, because now they look most like the person who committed the crime. And that sort of comparative analysis is really bad. The other problem that's a bigger problem is when the procedures aren't double-blind. All good science is double-blind, meaning when you do a pharmaceutical study and you're testing the pharmaceuticals, one test group gets placebos, the other test group gets the medicine. But it's important that the doctors giving out those pills don't know who got what, because now they'll treat those two groups differently. If you have a patient that has diabetes and you're not really giving them any diabetes medication, you might be saying things like, by the way, you should get on the treadmill, by the way, and cut down on your sugar, because you're probably going to die, because I'm not giving you anything. So it's important they don't know that information. It's the same thing in these procedures. The police officers who know who the suspects are cannot be involved in the process. They are terrible poker players. They often indicate, and even sometimes when they don't indicate during the process, you'll get a witness who'll say, it kind of looks like number 3, and then the officer will say, good job. Now by the time they get to court, they're like 100% sure it's this person. And they never were 100% sure. That's why it's also important to record all those procedures so later on we know what really happened. And here's a simple case example from this work and how it applies in our work. This 16-year-old girl got sexually assaulted in San Diego. She got pulled off a street. It's a horrible sexual assault case. There wasn't an actual rape. So there was no semen, but it was a sexual assault. She then flags down the police. They ask her to draw a picture of the suspect and the truck that he was driving. So she did these drawings. Okay, this is the guy, this is the truck. They search the neighborhood, they find this truck that matched the general description, being a truck with a camper. It belonged to my client's stepfather. They go to the house. My client matches the general description of a white male, late 20s. They then put his photo in a lineup, and this is the photo array that they used. What's problematic about this photo array, just from what you've learned in the last 10 minutes? Look at the drawing. Yes. There's only one feature on this drawing. It's a guy with a goatee. I mean, he probably had ears. Those aren't on there. It's not exactly detailed. I mean, you know, for good reason. This poor kid was traumatized, went through this horrible situation, and she just remembered it was a guy with a goatee. So then they put the photo array together, and they only put one guy with a goatee in it. Number one's got nothing. Number two's got no facial hair. Number three's got a little Scooby-Doo thing going on. My client has exactly the goatee in the drawing. This guy's got nothing. This guy's got the little separated mustache beard thing going on. So, of course, she picks my client. He actually says, after he gets convicted, he says in open court, it was heartbreaking when I read this, looks at her and says, someday they're going to figure out I didn't do this. I just want to say to you, I know you did the best you could here, and this isn't your fault. But, you know, they're going to figure it out. We then petition the court to DNA test her clothing. We find male pattern DNA everywhere we look. Doesn't match our client. But that's not great evidence, because it's probably disturbing to think about, but you all currently have DNA from other people on you because you're sitting in these chairs that other people have sat in. So we pick up DNA all the time. But via the miracle of the DNA data bank, and the day we ran the profiles, there were 10,535,000 profiles in it. We get a direct hit with this guy who lives in the neighborhood, who had prior sexual assault charges, and here's my client. She didn't do a terrible job, right? I mean, this isn't a cross-racial ID for me. It's a couple of white dudes. And similar hairlines, similar big foreheads, dark eyebrows, late 20s. It's not terrible, but it's not the right guy. And this is how simple it is. He looked like someone else in the world. And unfortunately, that someone else was out committing sexual assaults and lived in the vicinity. And here he is on the day of his release with his parents after 7 years in prison. Jason Kindle, another bad ID case I had, he was convicted based on a voice identification, believe it or not. This guy worked in an Office Depot. The Office Depot got robbed. The officer goes to the Office Depot, and he assumed it was an inside job because the robber knew who the manager was. Now see if you can figure that out next time you're in the Office Depot. That's the dude in the red shirt. The other ones wear blue shirts. But based on this assumption, they then do what? Let's do a background check on all the employees. My client Jason comes up with a marijuana charge. So then the officer walked around the store, and the robber had worn a mask and said, "Did it sound like Jason Kindle?" And one woman said, "Did sound like Jason Kindle." And he got convicted based on that, on a voice identification. We fortunately found a video of the robber entering the store, and we were able to use the height of the door to calculate the height of the robber. And had it been close, we would have lost, but he was 6 inches taller. And this is the day of his release. He was released by Judge Ito not long after the OJ case. Rafael Madrigal, terrible cross-racial ID. Rafael was working at a factory 30 miles away from the crime scene. His lawyer never went and checked that out. When we checked it out, we found his time cards, we found witnesses that put him there, and the most important evidence, his boss, who came in and testified that Rafael was running a machine in the middle of the assembly line, and if he hadn't been at work, the whole assembly line would have shut down. We then also found the shooter, who admitted to it on a jail call to his girlfriend, saying, "I don't know who this Rafael Madrigal guy is, but he's going down for that shooting I did." Which is, your nightmare client if I was representing him. Adam Riojas, another cross-racial identification, 13 years in prison, 2 white girls. He's Latino. Identified him from a distance. He's now a minister of a church in San Diego after spending 13 years in prison for murder. Guy Miles, 2 white bank tellers identified him. It was a robbery in Orange County. He'd never been to Orange County. He was in Nevada at the time of the crime, and he still got wrongfully convicted. And in fact, I'll show you a little video about him because I worked on that case for 15 years. You'll see here the face of a lawyer on the night of finishing a case after 15 years. And this is, when we brought Guy home, he didn't want to tell his parents he was coming home. And I said, dude, this is like late at night. We need to tell your parents. He's like, no, I want to surprise them. And the beginning of this video, he's telling his daughter he's coming home, but then we surprise his parents.
I am home, baby girl. I am home. Justin is right here. He's right here.
He's not lying. We're heading home and this nightmare is over. Yes, I mean, finally this 18-year nightmare is over for Guy and his family. They've been supporting him the whole time. They don't actually know he's coming home tonight, but we're going to bring him home right now to him. And, you know, it's just a huge relief for the California Innocence Project to be done with this case and bring him on home. We've been waiting a long time.
I don't even know yet. I don't even know. Oh, man.
What a shocker. Oh, my goodness.
Oh, man.
Wow.
Oh my God.
See, all these people right here been in my corner since day one and never wavered, not one bit. They knew I was innocent going in, they know I'm innocent coming out.
It always kills me. It's so, still earnest even after all that. So yeah, Guy Miles, another bad identification. Luis Vargas. Not one woman, not 2 women, 3 separate women identified Luis as the man who raped them. And we were able to link the rape scenes that Luis got convicted of with 30 other rapes that occurred in Los Angeles that all had basically the same MO. The victims were all Latino women. They were waiting at bus stops in the morning. Guy comes up who has a teardrop tattoo, asks for directions, and then sexually assaults them. One of those rapes actually happened while our client was on trial and in the jail, and the district attorney didn't think that would be important information to pass on, that the exact same MO rape has happened last night that you're on trial for today. But we were able to link those up with DNA, and this is the moment a judge told him that he was going home. Reggie Cole, 17 years, here's with his sisters, bad ID. Tim Atkins, 23 years in prison. When he went to prison, he was 17. This was another cross-racial identification. This day I brought him home, he was 40. And also, look at this picture, what this job has done to me. Look at that. Around here. There you go. Now, old man, old broken man. Quentin Morris, 27 years, another bad ID. Rolling Adams, 28 years, bad ID. Glenn Boyd, 28 years, bad ID. And these are all just cases out of my office. There's 66 Innocence Projects now in the United States. We have 150 now around the world. Everyone has a stack of these ID cases. They're everywhere. This is, by the way, one of my favorite lineups. Who's the suspect in this case? You're overthinking it. Throw out a number. What number? 18. No. 12. Who said 12? Gentlemen, you mean the guy in the headlock being held in the lineup by the police? That's not very suggestive yourself. Don't bring positive attention to yourself. Excellent. Excellent. You look a little shady. Smiles work. All right, sit down. I'll just save your lives. Chapter 5, I get into bad confessions, and the chapter is called You Get Confused When You're Tired and Hungry and People Are Yelling at You. I tried to write this book in a way that anybody could read it and understand this stuff, not make it overly legalistic, not make it overly scientific. That's really what it comes down to. Because in the old days in the US, and I'm not saying this never happens now because we still have police beating people up and violence going on, but it's in the minority of cases. What we more have now are long interrogations with psychological techniques to get the results. And we found those are as faulty often as beating someone in the head with a phone book in terms of getting bad confessions. A lot of people are cynical about this. How many of you think you would never confess to a crime you didn't commit? Go on, raise your hand. Don't be shy. There's my problem. Now, if this was jury selection, I'd say thank you for coming in and excuse you all. Because you don't really know until you're in the situation of an interrogation, 12, 13, 14 hours. And a lot of times it's not what you think that people are broken down. Usually it's because they're pissed. It's not more they're crying and sobbing. They're just like, give me that paper. Okay, I did it. Let me out of here. And then maybe they drum up a snitch. Maybe they get a bad ID, but you go down on a confession alone. We know that to be true. 17% of the wrongful convictions exonerated by DNA, those people confessed. We also know this technique called the Reed technique, where they've been training officers for decades on, is very faulty because it's not geared towards getting the truth. It's geared towards getting agreement. And fundamentally, that makes it faulty because it's about getting you to agree with the police officer's narrative that they already have. And that's very different than the truth. In chapter 6, I get into you have or care for a sick child because we see so many tragic baby death cases that are badly diagnosed. And the problem is that doctors learned in medical school, when they see these 3 symptoms, it's typically a case of abuse. And we now know that these things could also cause those symptoms, including just a regular birth. A regular vaginal delivery can cause the amount of pressure that can cause that kind of bruising. And in fact, statistically, at least 10 of you in this room had the triad of symptoms at birth, but then you went home and they dissipated. What if you fell off a changing table, hit your head, and then went back to the hospital? Well, now they'll do an MRI and a CAT scan. They'll find that bruising they didn't see at birth, and now you might get wrongfully convicted. In Great Britain, they went and reviewed all these old cases, released a lot of people. Unfortunately, in the United States, we have to fight this battle county by county. Ken Marsh is one of those clients. He spent 20 years in prison in a bad baby death case. This is the day I walked him out. Suzanne Johnson was a daycare provider, 21 years in prison. Alan Jimenez was the father of his daughter, who was a very sick child, wrongfully convicted, 24 years. And the most bizarre case I've ever worked on, Matt and Grace Hong, which were a couple I represented in Doha, Qatar, who were falsely charged with murdering their daughter. The prosecution had a theory. They starved her to death to harvest her organs. It was surreal. You can look that one up. There's a lot of news stories about it. And then you got a jury that was blinded by science. There's so much junk science out there we've learned by studying forensic sciences for the past several decades. There's problems with ballistic analysis. There's problems with bullet casings and how it's done. There's problems with bite mark evidence. Bite marks are not, it's not science. Is anyone here a forensic odontologist? Forensic odontologists are idiots, right? They're just, they are bored dentists who watch too much CSI. It's garbage. All these guys were wrongfully convicted based on bite mark evidence. It is just ridiculous. Fingerprints, not junk science, but there's a lot of new stuff we know now that can counter bad fingerprint evidence. There's the famous Madrid bomber case where they falsely went after this guy and misdiagnosed his fingerprints. Hair analysis is junk science. It's people looking at hair through microscopes. And there was actually a case in San Diego where an expert testified that the hair from the crime scene matched the suspect. They did DNA testing on the hair and found out it was carpet fiber. That's how good a science it is. And arson, there's a lot of good new science on arson that's disproven stuff we thought in the past. Again, arson, a lot of arson experts are bored firemen who watch too much CSI and they declare themselves experts. Joanne Parks, my client, spent 29 years in prison after a house fire killed her 3 children, and she got convicted of murdering her own 3 children, and ultimately we proved that it was faulty investigation. There's lots of bad child molestation cases. The city of Bakersfield, California leads the nation in these prosecutions. You can read the book Mean Justice about it or watch the Sean Penn movie Witch Hunt. But California is the leader. There's the famous McMartin preschool case that some of you may remember, which was the most expensive trial in the history of the United States, where these children told these stories about devil worshiping and the preschool teachers raping them. And they actually excavated the entire school area to find the underground caves that didn't exist. And they found out at the end it was all just made up, because the interviewers were so bad at questioning the children, they were suggesting stuff to them that they were parroting back to them. And there's a disturbing number of those cases. And then there's just the simple, somebody lied. Somebody lied and somebody got convicted. 1% of the wrongful convictions are the result of false informant testimony. My client Jason Purikow was a victim of that. My client Brian Banks was a victim of that. And Brian Banks is probably my most famous case. I'll show you a little video for those of you too young to remember it. It was a very large news story about 10 years ago when we got Brian out. There was a feature film made about it where Greg Kinnear plays me. If you want to check that out on Hulu. But here's his story.
And Brian Banks may be a long shot to make the final roster, but, that's okay.
We're going to start here with a story that reads like a movie. It's about a young guy with a promising NFL career derailed by a prison sentence for a crime he did not commit.
Yeah, it took him years to just clear his name, and now he's getting a second chance to pursue his dream. Sports anchor Rob Powers from our New York City affiliate WABC is here with more. So many people rooting for this guy.
Really a fascinating story. It's hard not to root for him. The National Football League preseason, it can drag on, but at least one player is enjoying every minute of it. The NFL has quarterbacks, halfbacks, and fullbacks, and this preseason, one very important comeback. 28-year-old Atlanta Falcon linebacker rookie Brian Banks is one step closer to making his dream a reality after taking to the gridiron against the Cincinnati Bengals this week.
Nice job getting off a block and making a play.
It's still one of those situations where, it happened. But now it's just replaying in my head.
But this is no ordinary rookie. Banks joined the Falcons after spending 5 years in jail and 5 on parole. Why? He was wrongly convicted of raping a high school classmate. In May 2012, justice was served. The verdict for Banks overturned. The new ruling, not guilty.
The people's motion to dismiss this case pursuant to Section 1385.
I may not ever get the answers as to why I was supposed to go through what I went through. But I know that I'm here today and I remain unbroken.
And you look at the NFL right now with all the stories that are out there, the arrests, the Aaron Hernandez saga that's played out in front of us in the media, based on the hope that he has shown all of us, I wouldn't bet against Brian Banks.
Before the charges, Banks was a high school football star, headed to the University of Southern California on a full scholarship to play for one of college football's best teams. But now what's in the past is in the past.
I will take this opportunity and be the best person that I can be in this world, and to show people that no matter what you go through, there is light at the tunnel.
The truth is that Brian committed no crime that day, that he's a strong young man with an amazing future, and we want to get him back on track.
And back on track he is. Banks signed with the Falcons in April and picked up 2 tackles in Thursday's game.
Definitely one of the best moments of my life.
It really is something. So it is on to the future. The Falcons open the regular season.
So, and that's, the idea of all this sophisticated stuff of why people get wrongfully convicted. It also just comes down to sometimes people tell a lie and it's not investigated. And that's what happened in this case is, again, the lawyer pled Brian out. Brian, on the day of trial, was offered a deal where he said, if you plea, you might get probation. If you don't plea, 44 years to life if we go in there and get convicted. And by the way, you're a big black teenager. You're probably going to get convicted. It's your word against hers. And no one ever really investigated the case. No one went to the crime scene. And he would, still have this conviction if it wasn't that years later, this young woman actually Facebook friend requested him and then said, can we let bygones be bygones? All that stuff I lied about you raping me in high school. And actually came forward and said that it never happened. Otherwise, it would have never been reversed. And the fact that that was videoed, her making those remarks. So you can see that movie on Hulu tonight if you want. So the lie by police, Danny Larson was just officers fabricating that he committed a crime. Horace Roberts, same thing. And then Mike Hanline, #1 in the history of California for wrongful convictions, 36 years in prison, totally innocent. This woman, by the way, waited 36 years for him to come home, his wife. They were married 2 years when he went to prison, and she waited 36 years for him to come home. His case was just completely fabricated. And then in the last chapter of the book, I talked about the most difficult thing to write about, the most difficult thing to point to, because in most of my cases I can say, this person was convicted based on a bad ID. This person was convicted based on a false confession. But it's very hard in 2022 to say, this person was convicted because they're black. This person was convicted because they're poor. Even though we know that race and poverty permeates the system at every level. And the statistics prove that out. It's just not the same as it was before, where it was blatant. It's more difficult to deal with because it's below the surface. But the reality is, if you believe the criminal justice system isn't racist, then you believe society isn't racist. Because it's just a microcosm of society. Just people who come from society every day into buildings to make decisions. And they bring with them all their biases, all their prejudices, everything from their life. And a lot of it is very subtle that they're not even aware it's happening. And a study that I talk about in the book is one where they used virtual reality and had a whole bunch of people watch trials, and the only thing they changed between the study groups was the race of the defendant. And they found dramatic differences in how often guilt was found and the sentences that were given. And it's just reality that people carry these things around with them, that empathy makes us trust some people more than other people based on our own life experiences. And we're not going to make that any better until we recognize it and start thinking about it. And in terms of poverty, I mean, this bail reform stuff that's going around the country, and a lot of people are criticizing it. But the bottom line is, why should some people get out of jail pending trial because they have more money than other people? That's like the fundamental root of it. And I can tell you, as a criminal defense attorney, the thing I liked the least was dealing with bail bondsmen. Not to mention it ruins some very nice downtown. Everywhere there's bail, there's a bunch of crappy bail bonds offices surrounding the courthouse, and it's hard for me to believe we actually have that as part of the U.S. system, is private enterprise interjected in it to create this weird thing called bail, but we've just kind of accepted it. And you know, it's undeniable that people who have more resources get more justice in the system. So if you're interested in daily rants like this, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at Justin O. Brooks. And if you're interested in my book, it's now available for pre-order on Amazon. All you gotta do is hold your phone up right here, right now, and you could order it. So I'll leave that up there on the screen. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I've gone probably way over time what I was supposed to, but if we got time for questions.
All right, thank you so much for that amazing talk and talking about such important and admirable work. I'm sure the students have many questions to ask you. So we are now transitioning into our Q&A portion of the evening. Please come up and line at either one of the mics to ask your questions. And when you come up, make sure to introduce yourself, say your name, your year, and your major. Please only ask one question and make sure to keep it brief. Thank you.
She runs a tight ship. I like it.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk tonight. I really appreciate it. My name is Charlie Hatcher. I'm a sophomore at CMC studying government. I'm curious, what advice you have for us, people who probably aren't out there committing crimes but are at risk of being looped into this system through many of these flaws that you mentioned. What your advice for us would be about talking to police. Is there anything at all that we can say to a cop that won't be twisted or somehow distorted into producing a charge or a conviction?
This might counter what your parents have told you, but I'm going to go there anyway because I'm a defense attorney. The only benefit of talking to the police is the convenience of maybe you won't be detained longer and it might be more convenient for you. But the police are not in any position to make deals. The police are empowered to lie to you. In fact, in California, we just got a law passed that they're not allowed now to lie to minors in interrogation, but they are to all of, none of you are minors anymore. You can all be lied to. And I've seen people wrongfully convicted from things like they drank too much last night, had a blackout, and now the police convinced them they committed a crime. So my advice is to be as polite and courteous as possible while you deny consent to do a search and refuse to answer questions without a lawyer present. In fact, I have a business card that says on the back of it, I do not want to answer any questions. I assert my constitutional rights, and please call the guy on the other side of this card.
Thank you.
But do it politely. Don't encourage a beating. It's never good.
Hi, my name is Lucy Goldberg. I'm a sophomore at CMC. I'm studying classics and film. And thank you for your talk. This is probably the first talk that I probably will buy the book for. And I just wanted to know that, like, these stories that you tell where these people essentially spent their, like, whole lives in prison. Like, do they get to sue someone? Do they get, like, some kind of reparations for all that lost time?
Great question. So when I came to California in 1999, the maximum you could get from the government in California was $10,000 for a wrongful conviction, no matter how long you've been in prison. And it was a whole legal process that you'd have to hire a lawyer to do, and so no one ever got anything. So we've written now 5 separate laws, 5 versions of a compensation law, and now you're entitled to $150 a day for every day you've been wrongfully incarcerated. So in the last 6 months, 2 of my clients I got out that served 20 years, they each got checks for $1 million. I still think that's, you can't give someone 20 years back, but I think it at least fulfills our responsibility to assist people in getting back on their feet. And the reason it's so important to have compensation laws, and 38 states now have them, is because it's so difficult to ever sue the government in a civil rights action. As a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is an incredibly powerful movement, Colorado just became the first state to take away police officer immunity from civil suits. But in every other jurisdiction in the United States, you are not going to be successful in those lawsuits unless you can definitively prove that they didn't make mistakes, that they intentionally set you up. And that's very hard to prove. So that's why that law is very important. And by the way, we also, in the last version, cut the Attorney General out of the process because the Attorney General fought us on every single one of those compensations, including, by the way, the current Vice President, who was very aggressive in our cases against us in not compensating our clients. That's why when I voted in the last presidential election, I went, well, definitely not that guy, but okay.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Olivia. I'm a junior gov major at CMC. I recently watched the Philly DA documentary series in a class last week, and we were having an interesting conversation about the whole progressive DA movement, because obviously, like, there's been a push for that, but then there's also been pushback with, like, recall elections in San Francisco that have ended up being successful in removing their DA, and then Krasner being in Philly undergoing an impeachment and all of that. So I would be interested to know your thoughts on the progressive DA movement, if, like, you see it being an effective process of criminal reform, or if it's not working. Yeah,
it's it's a very personal topic to me because 2 of my close friends, one ran for DA in San Diego. She was a public defender, and she lost. And then the director of the New Orleans Innocence Project did win. She's the second in command at the DA's office now in New Orleans. She's come under a lot of fire in the last week because she dismissed a bunch of gun charges from Mardi Gras, and now they're calling for her head. I want to be somewhat uplifting tonight if I can be, in the sense of I think sometimes, and we talked about this at dinner, is you get dragged down by all the bad news in the news because it's almost like if it's not bad, it's not news, right? If it's good, it's not news. So it's got to be the bad stuff we hear. And I think a lot of times we go 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I would say this. I am thrilled that it's even possible in the United States of America that criminal defense attorneys get elected to be prosecutors. I mean, I think that was unthinkable 20 years ago that would ever happen. And now we've seen it happen multiple times around the country. And they're just going to continue to be under attack, like George Gaskin here, and Larry Krasner, Emily Maw in New Orleans, Genevieve Jones in San Diego. And, so I feel positive about it in that I think we're making some movement forward. But it's really hard because politicians politicize criminal law more than any other area of law, where people get elected on tough on crime policies, where they can use fear to get votes. And we see this in every level of election. And most of you are too young to remember a guy named Willie Horton. But if there wasn't a guy named Willie Horton, we would have had a President Mike Dukakis. But George Bush I came up with this idea of, let's go find a guy who was out on parole who committed a crime, because then we can pin it on Mike Dukakis because he's governor of Massachusetts and technically in charge of the parole system. And since then, every politician has learned it pays to be tough on crime. You can get money from the corrections industry, support from the prosecutors union, support from the police. And so it's going to be an ongoing battle, but I think we are making progress. And I think for fiscal reasons, Americans are opening up to the idea of we can't just keep building prisons and we can't just keep pouring money into criminal justice. We saw that in California when they made the cut of $1 billion to the UC system. And they're like, where did all the money go? Well, it went to building 30 prisons in California over the last 25 years. So I think we're making progress, but there are certainly depressing stories out there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Thayer. I'm a senior at CMC studying PPE and government.
Studying PB and government?
PPE, it's our philosophy, politics, and economics major.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. A somewhat similar question. So hearing you talk, it makes me skeptical of both sides of both outcomes of the justice process. How it sets someone up for injustice because the police system's faulty, but also a jury trial system is faulty. I imagine that you have a checklist of reforms that you'd like to institute if you had your way. What is at the top list?
I mean, the first thing that pops in my mind is plea bargaining, because the reality is 95% of cases are resolved by plea in the United States. Only 5% of cases go to trial. So if we don't have good processes for investigation, and if we keep doing this thing of, as we've increased sentences over the last 30 years, the pleas have increased. Because when I got out of law school, when I was offered a plea on an armed robbery, let's say, the plea would be something like, if you take this deal, your client will get 5 years. If you don't take this deal, your client could get 10 years at trial. And in situations like that, they're not going to plead guilty when they're innocent, if they've got a chance at trial. But when, like Brian Banks, you go up to a 17-year-old kid, day of trial, and say, door number 1, possibly probation, door number 2, 44 years to life, now you got people choosing to plea who are innocent because you can't risk going to trial. So I think we've got to lessen how the criminal justice system is like a casino, in a way. And the only way to do that is to increase resources. And the only way to increase resources is to stop prosecuting certain crimes. And we've already seen that in California, by the way, for positive news. Since we legalized marijuana, and since we've dropped a number of other charges, we reformed felony murder rule. We're now not the largest prison system in the United States. It's now Texas. They overtook us in the last couple of years. And I think we dropped 40,000 people out of the prison system. So if you keep doing those kind of reforms, it frees up resources. And when you have more resources, then you can give people better service. It's the reason in Northern Europe they have such low recidivism rates, so they have more ability to deal with people in the system. But we're like, it's kind of like when a product goes from being handmade to made in a factory, it decreases in quality. And we've got a factory. That's the problem. So I'd say less like a factory would be my number 1 choice.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Gracie. I was wondering, Like, how do you choose the cases that you take? Like, what, when you're looking at potential cases, makes you think that it may be a wrongful conviction and, like, you could maybe prove it?
That's the hardest part of our work. When I first came to California in 1999, I didn't know how I would even get cases. And then the LA Times did an editorial, "Welcome Justin Brooks to California," and the mail has not stopped since then. So we get anywhere from 3,000 to 6,000 letters a year in my office. I have a team of law students, I have the undergraduates, I even have some high school students who work in there doing not necessarily as sophisticated work, but we need people to scan stuff. So we have, they love it. I bring them lunch. So I have this whole team and this whole system set up that is a little Ford assembly line theory in a way, but it's the only way to process cases. So what happens is we'll send a questionnaire out to the prison. We'll get as much information from the potential client as we can. We'll get a copy of their appellant opening briefs. We'll talk to their trial lawyer. We'll talk to their appellate lawyer. Then a law student will do an intake memo assessing the case. And then it'll get handed on to a lawyer, and a lawyer will decide, is this a possible case? And then the case will get worked up, and then twice a week we have presentations in my office, and all the lawyers sit around and the law students, and we present cases. I have the awful Caesar-like power of thumbs up or thumbs down of whether the case proceeds. And a lot of cases, sadly, the people could very well be innocent, but I know there's no way we can prove it, and we have the burden of proof. So for example, I've never won a drug case. I won one in Nicaragua because my client had no drugs. But the problem in the US is, US drug law is there's only two elements. You had drugs and you knew you had drugs. And if the jury believed that, there's no way to unring that bell. Self-defense cases are typically impossible because that's based on what the jury believed. So if I think it's possible, we move it along, we keep investigating, and eventually, hopefully, we get enough evidence to go to court. But it's a real process, and it's the only way that we can deal with thousands of clients a year.
Thank you.
All right.
Join me in thanking Professor Brooks for his amazing talk today.
Thank you.
I think we're all very sorry for your hairline, but we can all confidently say that the work you do more than makes up for that, hopefully. And to you all, thank you so much for coming out tonight and being with us today, asking such amazing questions. We hope to see you all here at the Yacht soon again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.